Japan is really prone to these disasters, but they didn't choose to move. They choose to build a new resilient system that makes them still standing and still thriving up to this date. That's why we're proud to propose. 3 points of model before we get into debate then. First, the contextualization on why it exists. A. There are really overwhelming disasters that got many victims. It becomes a problem because these areas are really prone to disasters to begin with, right? But we'll prove to you on how to move is actually really the beneficial in the first place. But B then, our BOP is simple to win this debate because this is a value judgment motion. We have to prove to you one, how mitigates really creates benefits, and two, how mitigates comes with more positive impacts and more less backlash from the society. Second, then, what mitigation and relocation really looks like. One, mitigation means that we're creating facilities or rules that reduces the negative impacts like earthquake resistant, more procedure on education mitigation, and three, refugee management, for example. Relocates meanings that we're moving the whole town to safer neighborhoods. It would cost them a lot more. Simply, we have to build new houses, new workforce, for example, new jobs to begin with. But three, then, what are the state incentives to actually avoid problems, death, and burdens to people because that's their job to begin with? But three, then, we're gonna prevent the argument about it's a safer choice by saying we're not being resilient in your case. Problems of state vulnerability is not solved under your side, thus it could cause more long-term problems because once state face a new problem, they're not used to get used to resolving it, but to actually run from it. Thus, it's not a resilient system. That's why we're proud to propose two arguments to support this then. First, the principle of justification on mitigation. A. Let's look at the context. These types of town has its livelihood to begin with. They come from many ancestral times that they already have jobs that's already suited their natural resources, already have their cultures, already have their special places to begin with. B. To move this, we cause two likelihoods that outcomes in unsucceeding. One, locals have to get used to the natural resources, meaning they have to get new jobs, they have to get new lifestyle, for example, that really burdens them simply because they're not used to it, they're not really educated on it, they're really not experienced on it, and also it would be worse because to place them into new household are really problems to begin with. Thus, it's actually two problems. In the beginning, that's why it's really a problem crisis. But two, then, cultural crisis too. Culture happens because relation of nature, like for example Batak eating smoked pork, for example, because there are a lot of pigs to begin with. Thus those type of cultures to begin with are really in risk of getting erased simply because they don't have the same natural resources, and people is really connected with the culture. That's why we will get more backlash in the first place in their case. But see, then it outcomes in unsucceeding, like we've stated before, and also backlash from the people because cultural erasure, and also they have to fit themselves into the new resources, and it really burdens them. That's why it will get attain more backlash. But see, then let's see the comparative one. We protect these jobs and cultures to begin with. Does people still feel loved? They still feel the connection with their jobs, with their cultures. They don't have to get new customs to the new resources. The state doesn't burden the civils too much. That's why we will not outcome in backlash, but we will actually outcome in the more positive nuance, for example. But second point then, how we solve these problems to begin with. A. To make more mitigation is really significant on practicals and more benefits simply because one, there are less cost. You don't need to build new housing or new town or work field. You only need to enhance the infrastructure. The cost will be smaller because it's not rebuilding the whole town. It's actually just to modify and build necessary infrastructure to begin with. It's really smaller in case, but because to have big costs is really that urgent because big costs could outcome in treasury deficit and debt. And how the state solve it by taxing the civils more, and that's why it's actually burdening the civils more under their side, and actually taxing them when they have no job. It doesn't really resolve that. Simply they don't get out of the crisis of economical crisis to begin with in their case. That's why we're proud to propose. But second, then, More prevention and regulation. Prevention and regulation is really enough simply because one, it makes people aware on things that they should do in crisis time, and it's really likelihood for them to actually follow this because it risks their own life. Thus, to actually survive, they actually have to follow these regulations to begin with, right? But two, then it prepares them when the disaster comes. They have calculated, meanings that they have planned the entire thing, even when the disaster really come into a bad place, for example, they really have planned on it. That's why it's really better in our side. For example, then there are mitigation in Mount Merapi, like in Jogja, like there are less to no victims because there are people, even when there are people living around it, because they have calculated the mitigation process. They have indicate when certain types of mount eruption will be beginning, will be start. For example, they will mitigate the whole place to begin with. But B, then it's way more important, simply one, because it creates a resilient system. State is used to solving facing and solving problems. It indicates resiliency. This is really important because when problems comes to the state, the state is really ready to face it because it is their custom to actually solve the problems, right? And under the comparison, your side will not bring a state into resiliency simply because you are used to just run from it, right? But second, then it brings a more collective society. Problems unite people. When they have faced problems, it'll unite them better because everyone is sharing the same condition. Thus, they will connect. This is really urgent because this is the type of society that's really necessary because good morality to care and help others teach them to not neglect others. Thus, they really revolves with the better incentives in the first place. Even when they got into really bad disaster, they can actually really move with collectivity, with more people helping each other, for example. But see, then let's be charitable. We will take the argument on the opposition from the opposition that mitigation will only reduce the impact, not fully remove the impact, like there are economical imbalances or life loss, for example. But here's our spin. We simply don't buy this argument because in the status quo, most of the cities that we're seeing, like Palu or Aceh, for example, does not implement the medications properly. That's why they be resolved in those type of case, right? And B, it's really not that significant because you've planned the whole scenario with this. You can expect the losses and prepares them for it. That's why it's really beneficial under ours. But second, then even if we still take this one, at least we don't burden the citizen to face a really new more customs to begin with. And two, the death in our side is really caused by nature. It's really more justifiable, whereas in your side this can actually happen because of the failure of relocation system, like outcomes of poverty, homelessness that really tortures them before they come to death. That's the death. It's actually outcomes from negligence from the state to begin with. Thus, the entry, then, we flip this by saying death under your case is really far more significant and unjustifiable because it's because the state it's because of the state failure. That's why we're proud to propose. Thank you.